Good morning. I'm Leandra Letterman. I'm the William W. Oliver Chair Emerita in Tax Law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law, and I'm the host of the Tax Policy Colloquium. It's great to see everybody here today. And I'm really pleased to have Professor Danny Schaffa with us. Professor Daniel Schaffa is an associate professor of law at the University of Richmond School of Law. He studies tax and law and economics. He has 5 degrees, all from the University of Michigan, a bachelor's in economics, a master's in economics, a master's in accounting, a master's in mathematics, and a PhD in economics. Professor Schaffa's tax research focuses on how the tax system can be designed to achieve socially desirable goals. His law and economics research focuses on crime, specifically how related crimes should be punished. And today he's presenting a pair of related papers, The Regressivity of Complexity and Towards an Understanding of Tax Complexity. And with that, Danny, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. So glad that everyone is here. Really looking forward to presenting this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This recently was one paper, and it became 2 papers. I started out really, what is the effect of tax complexity? And it turns out that that was a really, really hard question to answer. And so in the process of sort of getting a better and better sense of what I thought the effect of tax complexity is, it's sort of, this paper grew into 2. So the first paper is Towards an Understanding of Tax Complexity. And the basic idea here is virtually everybody agrees that the tax system is complex. But there are many, many, many different tax complexity conceptions in the literature, and they're often presented without much exposition. And so when you see the term tax complexity, it can actually be really hard to know what the particular paper is talking about. And this, through the process of reading, I don't know, 50, maybe 60 papers, I started sort of coming up with this list of questions that I could ask myself. And if I asked them every time I saw the term tax complexity, I started to have a much better sense of what a particular conception of tax complexity was. So those, we'll talk more about this, but those questions are: whose comprehension is affected? What is the effect? Is there any sort of normative framework, any sort of underlying assumptions, and what is the causal model? The second paper was actually my original idea that I was interested in, which is complexity regressive or progressive, or we can't say? And here, I would say that the big takeaway is that when you're trying to think about the effect of complexity, it's really, really hard because we don't observe what I call sort of exogenous changes to complexity in the tax system, right? There's always something else that's changing too. And so it's very hard to know if it's the complexity that's changing outcomes or if it's the something else. And so what you need to do is counterfactual analysis, and the answer depends entirely on how you set up the counterfactual. And then I'm going to suggest one plausible approach. I would love to hear what people's perspective on this, if this is persuasive, but the idea is you sort of look at all of the major players in the tax system, and you look at how complexity affects all of them, and then you try to sort of combine this into one aggregate idea of what complexity does in the tax system. Okay, so roadmap. I'm going to start off with a motivating example, talk about the state of the tax complexity literature, and then sort of present my clarifying questions, and then go through a couple of case studies using those questions to see kind of how they play out in a particular context. Then I'll talk about the second paper, the regressivity of complexity. And again, the main takeaway here, what I think is sort of the bigger contribution, is not what I think that complexity might be regressive. It's sort of highlighting these analytical challenges of thinking about what complexity, how you would even figure out what the effect of complexity is. Okay, so here's my motivating example. Say that Congress wants to simplify the tax system. Do you make the code longer, more definitions, more definite provisions, or shorter and leave it more ambiguous? And this is actually something the literature has grappled with for a long time, at least 60 years, and people have come out to different answers. And I think one of the reasons that people come to different answers is they're looking at different perspectives, right? And I mean, I'm not saying definitively shorter codes are easier for taxpayers. This is just like a stylized hypothetical. But say, for example, shorter code, easier to process, less complex for the taxpayer. Shorter code, easier to draft, less complex for the policymaker. But more definite code, easier to administer, easier to enforce, to litigate. So that sort of runs the other way. So whose perspective matters? Secondly, how would we even measure it, right? So say Congress said, okay, we're going to make the shorter code, to make the tax code shorter, and now we're going to try to figure out, is it more complex or less complex? How would we measure that? Would we look at the time and the money that people spent complying with tax law? Would we look at the mistakes that people made? And sort of the key here is that those things could actually move in different directions, right? You could imagine making the code or making a change to the code and more time and money is spent, but fewer errors or vice versa. And then lastly, like, why do we care, right? And why do we care plays into how we're going to measure this or whose perspectives. Like, these are all sort of interrelated questions. So we might care for equity reasons, right? Low income taxpayers missing benefits, or high income taxpayers evading and avoiding, or lobbying, right? These are all sort of reasons that people have suggested in the past. And there are also efficiency implications, right? Complexity can lead to wasted resources, and it can obscure incentives, right? Incentives, make it harder for taxpayers to know kind of what's in their best interest, and that can actually make it more difficult for policymakers to design effective policy. Okay, I think I said that. Okay, so the state of the tax complexity literature, there's just no consensus on definitions, on framework, or on measurement. So, for a while, I was having fun collecting these quotes. It's sort of common practice in tax complexity papers to start off your paper by saying, like, we don't know what the definition is, right? And there are all these sort of varieties. And sometimes you will find a precise definition, most often in an econ paper in a very sort of stylized behavioral model, but sort of general definitions, I'm not aware of people, often at least, attempting one. Most people just sort of say it's very hard and leave it at that. We also have a number of different typologies for complexity. And so, I'm also collecting this sort of list. You've got one from a couple of Portuguese authors. They have 14 areas of tax complexity. And the key here, one, is just they're different, right? You can read them. They're very clearly talking about different things. So to give you some example, Slumrod, he is mostly talking about costs, right? Transaction costs that people are bearing. Whereas Golden is more talking about errors that people make. Slemrod is talking mostly about taxpayers and enforcers or administrators. McCaffrey actually has this what I think is kind of a nice conception that you see floating around, not in many conceptions, but it's important. And that is the economic context in which the tax system is situated actually determines in part its complexity. And same thing with demographic context, same thing with legal context. All of those things, depending on how you define tax system, can actually make the tax system more or less complex. So they're talking about different perspectives of different players in the tax system. They're talking about different effects. They've got different causal chains, and there's sort of different normative frameworks and assumptions built into these things. And crucially, it is not always clear. So sometimes they come out and in these conceptions make very clear, I'm talking about mistakes or transaction costs. Sometimes they don't. And you can go through the whole paper and kind of try to reverse engineer from the examples what the conception of complexity is. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's very, very vague. Um, so, um, and then sort of related to this, there's no standard measure of tax complexity, right? People have noted that things like the number of words in the tax code is kind of not necessarily a great measure, because what really matters is how many of those words apply to people, right? You could have a very long tax code, but if none of that really applies to most people, it's sort of not as complex. And people have actually studied this, and the number of words in tax statutes doesn't actually correlate very neatly to other things like the total cost of revenue collection. Indices, total cost of revenue collection, I'm like now starting to get a little nervous on time, so I'm going to sort of skip ahead. But no standard measurement is the main takeaway. So what's my contribution? So my contribution is this. Every time you see scholarly work that's dealing with tax complexity, there is an underlying conception of tax complexity. And it doesn't matter if it's in a measure or a model or a claim or a theory, there is an underlying conception. And often these conceptions are implicit. And so what questions can we ask as we're sort of, looking at this particular conception to clarify? And the 4 questions that I've found most useful as I'm going through the literature are: whose comprehension is affected by complexity? What effect does complexity have on these people? What, if any, are the normative assumptions built into the conception? And then what is the causal model of complexity in this conception? So whose comprehension? The most common comprehension that people look at is taxpayer, right? Very common to sort of see like how complex is something for the taxpayer. But actually, it's helpful to break it down even further, because taxpayers do different things in the tax system, and complexity might affect those different activities in different ways. So the more granular level is not just whose comprehension, but what activity. So taxpayers, they comply, they plan, they dispute, they report. And there's a lot more research on taxpayer compliance and sort of relatively less on disputing and reporting. And my own sense is that actually taxpayer planning might be the most important activity that complexity disrupts. From the policymaker's perspective, they have to decide what objectives they're going to try to achieve with the tax system. So obviously we're raising revenue, but tax systems in the past have been used to penalize people, redistribute income, correct externalities, deal with inflation. So that's a hard problem, and complexity in the tax system makes that harder for policymakers. They also have to design ways to protect revenue, so audit mechanisms, withholding mechanisms, reporting mechanisms, and then administrators, right? So they have to detect evasion, and they have to figure out eligibility, qualification, how all these terms apply. Are the taxpayers doing it correctly? And then voters, they have to find which candidates are proposing policies that match with their preferences. And a key thing is that there are different things that make different activities complex. So for example, the policymaker's problem gets much harder if there is just a lot of heterogeneity in the population and a complicated economic environment and international transactions. That makes the policymaker's problem much harder. The taxpayer's problem is sort of more dependent on things like the tax code. So it's not the same set of things that are making this problem hard for the different players. Okay, what effects? So I've sort of hinted at this. I sort of think that there are 3 possible things that tax complexity can do to people. Transaction costs, right? Your sort of time and money spent, the propensity to err, right? You're going to make mistakes, complying, or policymakers make mistakes, or administrators make mistakes, or voters make mistakes. And then psychic costs, right? The sort of stress of dealing with the tax system. And there's research that suggests that the more complex tax law is, for example, the more stressful it is for taxpayers. Normative framework, I think this one is sort of relatively intuitive, but sometimes these conceptions are clearly geared towards answering normative questions. So is complexity creating advantages for high means taxpayers, or is it leading to low take-up rates for benefits intended for low means taxpayers? Sometimes it's an efficiency paradigm, right? So complexity is obscuring incentives or leading to waste. And one sort of way to think about the efficiency consequences that's helpful to me is like aggregate consequences, right? So we have more accountants and fewer engineers, for example, or lower GDP, something like that. Okay, causal model, I'm gonna skip that. So, case study, let's apply these questions to something like the EITC, right? Okay, so who's comprehension? So what makes the policymaker's problem hard? What's the policymaker trying to do with the EITC? And I don't know if I said this, but here we're assuming a benevolent policymaker. I'm sort of burying the political economy stuff in the voter and the normative. So just assume that this is a benevolent policymaker. Well, if you have lots of different types of families, multi-generational, separated, divorced, non-traditional, it's much harder to design a policy that varies credit with the number of qualifying children and have that sort of play out in predictable ways. From the taxpayer's perspective, it's like, am I eligible or not? And then how much credit do I claim? For the administrator, also trying to figure out who is eligible, and then also what type of audit procedure. And for the EITC in particular, most of the audits are not the in-person audit that I think most people have in mind. They're correspondence audits, right? They get a letter and they're sending out hundreds of thousands of these letters every single year. 50% of these correspondence audits, over 50%, result in the denial of the credit because of taxpayer non-response, either because the taxpayer never replies or because the taxpayer never receives the IRS letter. And then voters, they feel very differently, at least on average, between tax credits and welfare payments. So if you think of the EITC as sort of a welfare program, at least for working people, it might be much more popular than something that is run, that has the same economic effect, but is run outside the tax system. And then effects, it's sort of the same list. Transaction costs, errors, and psychic costs. One sort of additional thing that I want to point out here is that part of the transaction cost is going to include things like refund anticipation loans. That's what the RALs that I have there. So a lot of refund anticipation loans are actually based on EITC credits, right? So a tax preparer does low income taxpayers return and hey, you get the EITC, I'm going to lend you some money. Sometimes there's 260% annual interest rate on these loans. And sometimes there's tax preparer fraud where they sort of, say that the taxpayer is eligible for more EITC than they actually are. And then the taxpayer makes this loan, keeps some money. So the IRS has sort of a lot of work on this area. Another case study is this total resource cost of revenue collection. So this, I would say, is currently the gold standard for how we measure complexity in tax systems. We take all of the compliance costs that taxpayers face, so the hours, convert them into dollars, plus the dollars of compliance costs, and then add them to basically the IRS budget. And that is what we sort of think of as the total resource cost of revenue collection. Well, what is this measure missing and what is this measure capture? It's not really capturing the complexity that the taxpayer faces, at least not directly. Maybe in some indirect sense, policymaker faces a complex problem, which leads to more compliance costs, but it's not directly capturing that. Taxpayer compliance costs, they're captured. Taxpayer planning costs, not so much. Taxpayer disputing costs, also potentially not. And even more importantly, taxpayer errors are not captured in this. So if you have a taxpayer that is not claiming the EITC and this taxpayer is eligible, the total resource cost of revenue collection does not capture that. That is not part of the error. Voters aren't included. Most enforcement costs are included, but there might be some other administrative costs, things that Treasury does, for example, that help administer the tax code that are not included. Effects, again, we're only directly measuring transaction costs, not errors or psychic costs. And there's an implicit assumption here that $1 of compliance cost is the same regardless of who bears it, right? They're sort of aggregating all of these compliance costs, but that sort of disallows normative judgments that would say, actually, we feel differently about compliance costs that are borne by low-income taxpayers as opposed to high-income taxpayers. So again, I'm not trying to say this is a bad measure of tax complexity. I'm just saying, given the entire universe of tax complexity conceptions out there, this is not capturing everything, and it's important to understand that. Okay, on to paper number 2, regressivity of complexity. So, turns out you have to spend a lot of time defining a lot of terms, as all the students probably know, having suffered through this paper. First is, what is progressivity? And in some sense, this isn't that hard. Average tax rate increases with income. But what if you have regimes where the marginal tax rate increases and then decreases? And people might think that's not what we have in the US, but considering that the income of many high means taxpayers is taxed at preferential rates, we might actually have this over certain ranges of the income distribution. Turns out there are mathematical formulas that you can use that turns out not to be that big a problem. A sort of bigger problem is, what do you do? How do you compare, how do you think about a tax change that changes the distribution of burdens now, but also results in less revenue, right? At some point, something else is going to have to change to account for that, right? That could be, fewer goods in the future, higher taxes in the future, more debt. What does that do? So it turns out that it's actually a very difficult question to answer. What is happening if I don't collect the same amount of revenue after a tax policy change? And then the second question is, what is tax complexity? Well, we're all experts on that. We just, spent 15 minutes talking about that. Okay. Now, what can we learn by comparing 2 different tax systems? So imagine you just have 2 different tax systems, or even tax system, A, and then I add a bunch of new complex tax laws that do a bunch of things. So clearly the, A modified is more complex. Can I actually learn anything by comparing those 2 tax systems? And the answer is not really. The problem is, unless the only thing you have changed is tax complexity, you can't know whether the change in progressivity is due to the change in complexity or the change in something else. Similarly, if you attribute all the difference in the change of progressivity to the change in complexity, then complexity becomes a catch-all. So any change you make is changing the complexity. And then the second sort of problem is that there's no definite claims possible. It's very easy to imagine ways to make the tax system more complex that would also make it more regressive or more progressive. You could go either way very easily. So how can we answer this question in a way where we sort of can change the complexity of the tax system, leaving everything else the same? And the sort of fancy econometric term for this is an exogenous change, right? You're changing something, holding everything else constant. And if we did that, and we saw whether outcomes were more progressive or regressive, we would know whether complexity is regressive or progressive. So we don't have a lot of policies where we're just changing the complexity of the tax system. Actually, we don't have those at all, right? That just doesn't exist. And so all of this is going to have to be based on thought experiments, which basically means we're going to imagine a counterfactual tax system where the only thing that we've changed is tax complexity. And everything is going to hinge on how we define this counterfactual. And there's no a priori right way to do it. So, you do it and then you hope it's persuasive, and then you can come to some sort of understanding. So it turns out they're kind of even more conceptual problems, which is you have to change complexity in a way that affects all comprehensions in a similar way. So for example, if I change the complexity in the tax system by only making it, harder for the wealthiest taxpayer, well, that's going to be progressive. And similarly, if I make a change that only makes the EITC more complex, then it's probably regressive, right? So on top of that, you have to be very careful with your thought experiment to make sure that you're sort of changing everything for everyone in the same way. So I do have what I think is a correct definitive result. We can talk about sort of how useful it is. So thinking about complexity faced by taxpayers, if tax literacy and access to tax advice correlate with means, and if all taxpayers face the same problem, then tax complexity is regressive. The problem with this is that the problems that taxpayers face are different. And so you have to find a way to sort of make comparisons across taxpayers over the income distribution. And just to sort of show you how this could go either way, imagine that, in a stylized model, the only complexity that we have in the tax system for low income taxpayers is EITC. And the only complexity for high income taxpayers is sort of investment strategy stuff. Well, if EITC complexity costs low income taxpayers 3%, and the investment strategy stuff costs high income taxpayers 1%, then complexity is regressive. But you can imagine flipping that, right? One way you could flip that is just by decreasing the amount of the EITC benefit. And then at some point, that gets to 0.5%. And now suddenly you get the opposite answer. So this is a really challenging empirical question. I try to dabble with it a little bit in the paper. I certainly haven't persuaded myself, but I would be interested to know if any of you were persuaded or how I could make it sort of more persuasive. The complexity faced by administrators, here actually I think there is sort of more evidence to suggest that complexity is regressive. So there's this famous Minnesota tax experiment where they sent out letters to taxpayers saying, hey, you're going to be audited next year. And low and moderate income taxpayers, they responded by reporting more income, presumably sort of more honestly, right? High income taxpayers reported substantially less income. And of course, we don't know exactly why, but one plausible reason is that the high income taxpayers viewed it as the starting point in a negotiation. Because it's just much harder to enforce tax law on high means taxpayers, it's just more negotiation than it is an investigation into what actually the correct tax consequences should be. International tax shelters, I've got another slide, I'll show you that in a second. And then, EITC audits, right? We have data on which types of taxpayers are not responding to EITC audits. It is the lowest income taxpayers, right? They are the ones that are not receiving IRS mail or not responding to IRS mail. So here's the sort of slide on international tax shelters. And this is a very, very new paper by a couple of economists. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to measure something very, very difficult. They're trying to measure the distribution of sophisticated international tax evasion. And on the bottom of the graph, you've got the position in the income distribution, and the black is basically the sophisticated evasion, right? You could kind of think like Panama Papers type stuff. And then the gray is sort of less sophisticated evasion, right? Cash transactions, that sort of stuff. And you'll see that looking at less sophisticated evasion, there isn't that much difference between different types of taxpayers. You could actually even see a larger percentage of underreporting at the bottom. But once you include the sophisticated evasion, it shifts and there's more underreporting at the top. And again, this is sort of one paper's take. It's a very difficult thing to measure because people are not honestly declaring how much they're evading. Oh, okay, so complexity faced by policymakers. When the tax system is complex, policymakers write tax law that creates unintentional tax benefits. So, we can talk more about this, but there's the Up-C, backdoor Roth, the trust. Peter Thiel, I guess he's got like billions of dollars in a Roth, right? Like that was not supposed to happen, but there's enough ambiguity or complexity that it's happened. Historically, lots of passive losses. I'm sure those weren't intended by Congress. Financial instrument arbitrage, various ambiguities, and all of those tend to benefit high means taxpayers, and then some of them can actually make low means taxpayers relatively worse off. So, for example, some of the ambiguities in the tax system, and then voters. They succumb to political advertisement, counter to their preferences. A few years ago, Washington wanted to raise taxes on the wealthy, polled tons of people. Everyone sort of was very much in support. And then it actually came time to vote, and they did not vote in favor of it. And it seems like there was sort of this disconnect between their policy preferences and how they voted. And that is just the complexity is sort of one explanation. Sort of similar thing with the estate tax. It's unclear why so many people hate the estate tax that's going to tax estates of more than 12 or $13 million, but they do. Okay, so is complexity regressive? The main takeaway here is not that I want you to think the answer is yes or no. The main takeaway is that this is a very analytically challenging question, right? You need to do counterfactual analysis, which is not easy. You need to make lots of assumptions about what complexity is, not easy. And we have very limited empirical evidence. There's relatively more on the EITC, and now there's starting to be more on international tax sheltering and some other sort of common taxpayer errors, but there's sort of nothing comprehensive. So my view is that yes, complexity is regressive if you account for all of the comprehensions and all the effects, but I'm not fully convinced by that myself. I think it's an interesting starting point for some dialogue. Policy implications. So this is kind of a moving target, but my current thinking on this is if there is a more complex environment, and by that I mean you've got more demographic heterogeneity, more complex economic systems, legal systems, if you add that to complex tax laws, you get regressivity. So policymakers should be mindful that the more complex an environment they're trying to tax, the more they should probably lean towards simple tax laws, or at the very least, they should account for the possibility that complex tax laws could be regressive. I think we've talked about all these examples before. So, okay, again, the conclusion. So the first paper's big conclusion is that there is so much going on with tax complexity, right? The term is being used in very, very different ways. And I believe that all of these uses have underlying them a conception of tax complexity, but it's not always clear what that is. We can get clearer on what that is by asking these clarifying questions. And in a perfect world, people that are writing in the tax complexity space would just start off by saying, hey, this is my conception of tax complexity. It's the following people's perspectives or the following activities. It has the following effects. These are sort of my normative assumptions, and this is my causal model. That would, that's sort of my dream. We are nowhere near that, but that would be good. And then the other sort of conclusion is that understanding the effect of tax complexity is really, really, really hard. But I think it's important because we are making policy in complex environments. And so we should be spending time on trying to find ways to understand what effects complexity has. And here I focus on progressivity, but it's the same thing for, other measures of equity, for efficiency, for all sorts of other effects. We could use the same thing. And then lastly, I've got this plausible argument that complexity is regressive, and I'm, very open to hearing people's thoughts on that. So with that, I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much for your time on this Friday morning, and happy Groundhog's Day.